These are cards you should never draft in Secrets of Strixhaven. Now, never is a bit of a strong word, so let's just say these are cards that are very weak in general, so you need a very specific reason to want to include them in your deck, and you should generally just hope to leave them on the sidelines. First up is Ulna Alley Shopkeep. For 2 into black, you get a 2/3 with Menace and Infusion. This creature gets +2/+0 as long as you gained life this turn. There just isn't as much consistent life gain as you would need to make this a 4/3 in the majority of cases. There are some synergies where you can assemble this to be a 4/3 for multiple turns in a row, but the problem is if you don't get those synergies, you've got an almost embarrassingly weak card. A 3-mana 2/3 is just not where you want to be these days. There are just much better options you can be including in the 3-mana spot. And those options are so frequent that you should not have to include the Ulna Alley Shopkeep in your deck. Unless something has gone terribly wrong, you should generally avoid just putting this card in your deck, because the worst case scenario, which is the floor of this card, is really, really low. And the upside of getting a 4/3 for 3 mana isn't even that high in this modern era of Magic. And as a result, Ulna Alley Shopkeep is not worth including in your deck. Next up is Borrowed Knowledge. For 2 red white, you get a sorcery that says, choose one, discard your hand, then draw cards equal to the number of cards in target opponent's hand, or discard your hand, then draw cards equal to the number of cards discarded this way. This card is very weak because for 4 mana, you're not affecting the board state at all. You have very little control over how many cards are in your opponent's hand, so if you're playing a matchup where they have few cards in their hand, this does absolutely nothing for that mode. And if you're ever using it to discard your hand and draw cards equal to the number of cards discarded that way, then you end up down a card, because Borrowed Knowledge is a card that you're playing from your hand. And so if you say have 4 cards in your hand at the start of the turn, you play Borrowed Knowledge, you'll discard the remaining 3 cards in your hand to draw 3. You went from 4 cards to 3 cards with your 4 mana sorcery that you cast. So you basically spent 4 mana to go down a card, which is just never where you want to be. And as a result, Borrowed Knowledge is an atrocious card that you should try to never put into your deck. Next up is Fractal Anomaly. For 1 blue mana, you get an instant that says create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token and put X 1/1 counters on it, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn. So the default state of this is on your turn, you can spend 1 mana to get a 1/1, which is not where you want to be at all. If the dream is to combine this with some sort of card draw effect, so you play like a draw 2 and then play Fractal Anomaly and get like a 1 mana 3/3 or something of that nature. But the problem is that there isn't as much card draw as you might think. Even if you have a couple of card draw spells in your deck, Fractal Anomaly's payoff is not really worth the fact that in the majority of cases, you're going to have to run this out to get like a 1 mana 1/1, or the fact that even if you have to do that half the time, the 1 mana 1/1 is such a weak card that it's going to lose you games simply by being such a low impact play on the board. And it's just so hard to get this thing to work in a way that is going to consistently get you an advantage. Even if you're in the mid game and you manage to get Fractal Anomaly to be like a 2/2 or maybe a 3/3 sometime, if you get a really good combo going with it, you've still had to wait a long time with a dead card in your hand. And just avoiding Fractal Anomaly is going to mean that you just put a better card into your deck that has a more consistent effect on the game. Because by the time you're comboing Fractal Anomaly to be something a little bit bigger, you could just have put a card that cost more mana into your deck and had a bigger impact on the game on its own into your deck. And so Fractal Anomaly, not a card you should be looking to include. Next up is Biblioplex Tomekeeper. For 4 mana, you get a 3/4, and it says when this creature enters, choose up to 1. Target creature becomes prepared, target creature becomes unprepared. Generally, just 4 mana 3/4 is a bad stat line these days. It's just going to be a weak impact on the board state. There's bigger things. There's a lot of cards in this format that grow over time to snowball past a 3/4. And the fact that you can make something unprepared or you can prepare something isn't a big enters effect, because a lot of the times you're not running out of things to spend your mana on, because your prepared creature, you don't really need to re-prepare it, because spending the mana on it the first time already gave you more cards, more stuff to do. If your opponent has a creature that is somehow prepared and you get to unprepare it, that's also not the biggest deal, because it tends not to be a format about running out of things to do. It tends to be much more about making a big impact on the board, having an effect, and a 4 mana 3/4 is not having the effect you want. Generally, if you find yourself in a situation where you would want to be putting Tomekeeper in your deck, it just means that something's gone horribly wrong, because there are so many better cards in this format, and a 4 mana 3/4 is not where you want to be. Next up is Daydream. For a single white mana, you get a sorcery that says exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it, and then it has flashback for 2 and a white. Now, the problem with Daydream is it generally requires very specific synergies in order to make it feel like a good card. You need to have a card that has a good enters effect, because just spending a single mana to get an extra counter on your creature at sorcery speed isn't going to cut it. And even with the fact that you can do that again with flashback, getting a couple counters on your creatures for 4 mana is not going to be good enough. So you need to have something that has a good enters effect. So that's already a very specific combo. Add in the fact that if you are on the back foot at all, Daydream is going to be very, very useless for you because you might not even have a creature in play at all. You just need something that you can throw into play to block, or something that you can like deal with your opponent's creatures, and you've drawn Daydream, which is just a very minor impact on the game unless you have the very specific combo that goes with it. And there's just much better ways to spend your mana. The alternatives to playing Daydream is going to be cards that affect the board state a lot more. And as a result, you're going to be much happier leaving Daydream on the sidelines, because in the aggregate number of games, you're going to be happier with whatever card you're playing over Daydream, maybe like a 3/3 creature or something like that, because it's easy to think, oh, Daydream's really good with this specific card in my deck, but you're not going to draw those two cards together all that often, and there's just not the redundancy to make Daydream an effective card, especially because, as I already mentioned, it's really quite poor if you are on the back foot. Next up is Growth Curve. For green-blue, you get a sorcery that says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then double the number of +1/+1 counters on that creature. So the way that a lot of the time the mind works is it goes to like the best case scenario. Let's say you have like a 3/3 fractal token in play, which means it's a 0/0 with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. You play Growth Curve, all of a sudden you get the 4th counter, and then double them. All of a sudden your 3/3 turned into an 8/8. Now, that's like a scenario where you look to be like, oh, that's a very powerful effect to do. Adding 5 power and toughness permanently to a creature can definitely be an effective thing to do. But the downside is if you're on the back foot and you don't have any creatures in play, Growth Curve does nothing. If you don't have one of the fractals in play, Growth Curve can be like put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature for 2 mana at sorcery speed, which is horrific. It's like putting an aura on your creature, just makes it a huge target for removal. Oftentimes your opponent will have some way to interact with that creature, and you've just 2-for-1'd yourself because you put all of your eggs into one basket. And if you like are on the defensive, you want to be adding like independent creatures to the board that can like block and things like that. And Growth Curve does very little on the defensive. On the offensive side of things, sometimes even just putting 2 counters on a creature does very little. If you don't have exactly a fractal token that has counters on it already, it just does very little as well. And again, it's one of those cards that needs like very specific cards to synergize with, and is also very bad when you're behind. And Growth Curve, as a result, is not the card you want, especially because blue-green often kind of has this inevitability built in where you can like kind of out card draw your opponents in the late game and things like that. And you don't need these kind of like cheesy ways to get like a win, especially because, as I already mentioned, if you are playing Growth Curve and you draw it when you're behind, or even in the state of parity a lot of the time, you're not going to be super happy adding 2 counters to one of your creatures or something of that nature. And it's going to be a really liability card to draw in your games. Next up is Blazing Firesinger. For 2 and a red, you get a 2/3 that enters prepared. And its prepared spell is Seething Song. For 2 and a red, it's an instant, add 5 red mana. Now, if you play Blazing Firesinger on turn 3, and then on turn 4, you cast Seething Song and immediately cast like a 6 mana spell, you're going to be feeling pretty strong. But the problem is you're not always going to have Blazing Firesinger on exactly turn 3. And even if you do have it on exactly turn 3, you're not always going to have a good way to spend the mana on turn 4. And a 3 mana 2/3 is just not a good stat line these days. If it doesn't have any other abilities, it's similar to how a 4 mana 3/4 kind of puts you behind just by including in your deck. Blazing Firesinger being a 3 mana 2/3, there are going to be cards that your opponent spent like 2 mana on, or 1 mana on even, that are going to grow over the course of the game into bigger threats, and your 3-drop is kind of irrelevant against them. Or you're just going to top deck this card in the mid game and you're just going to have a random 2/3 where your opponent's going to be top decking like much more relevant plays, because there are so many good 3 mana cards in this format, 4 mana cards in this format. There are much better things you can be drawing, whereas this card just lets you like really accelerate out like one card if you draw this in the exact right situation. You end up in these spots where if you draw this in any other situation, you're kind of unhappy to have it because you don't necessarily have a good way to spend that 5 mana. And also just like the 2/3 body, even if you do then end up accelerating something out, the game can keep going, the game progresses, and the temporary boost in power level isn't going to help you over the long run in many cases, because the game will be relatively slow. People will have time to deploy the cards out of their hand normally, and just hitting land drops and things like that. And so the temporary acceleration doesn't really justify the Blazing Firesinger being kind of a liability as a 3 mana 2/3. So unless you have a very specific reason to play the Blazing Firesinger, it should be a card that you're generally leaving on the sidelines and not prioritizing, especially because if you are taking Blazing Firesinger in the draft, it means you're not taking other cards, and there are just a lot of good cards these days, and so you have to raise the bar for what you're happy playing in your deck, or what you're willing to play in your deck even. Next up is Rabid Attack. For 1 and a black, you get an instant that says, until end of turn, any number of target creatures you control each get +1/+0 and gain when this creature dies, draw a card. Now, the problem with Rabid Attack is that +1/+0 is such a minor stats boost that in the majority of combats, it's not going to be doing a lot to swing the needle. If you attack a 3/3 into your opponent, at your opponent and they block with their 3/3, like Rabbit Attack isn't going to really contribute in a meaningful way. The best you can do is like play Rabbit Attack, your creature's dying, you basically just turned Rabbit Attack into a new card. The best case scenario, which is obviously where your mind like wants to go with these cards, is you attack with like 3/1/1 creatures, your opponent blocks them with 3/2/2 creatures, you play Rabbit Attack, all of the trades happen and you draw 3 cards. But that's not going to happen very often. There's not really these like giant go wide board states that are all going to attack into creatures that they end up trading off with. In that sort of situation, if you attack with your 3/1/1s, your opponent's going to often have like a 2/3, a 3/3, and maybe 1/2/2. And then like in the best case scenario, your 1/1s like chump attacked and you turn them into new cards. But it's like not going to happen as often as you think, and a lot of the time it's going to be the sort of thing where your Rabbit Attack lets your 2/2 trade with their 2/3 and you drew a card, which is like not like a high enough upside to be worth including this in your deck, because a lot of the time you're just using this as a 2 mana, like basically draw a new card from your deck. And again, when you're spending your mana in a relatively ineffective way like that, it's not going to help you win the game. You'd rather just play a card that does something on its own. If you care about the potential card advantage of Rabbit Attack from turning your random 1/1s into creatures, you can just find another card that gives you a little bit of card advantage like every single time without having to rely on very specific board states and combat situations. And if you are trying to get a more combat oriented spell, you can just try to find a better combat trick that's going to be more effective at doing what you want your combat tricks to do, because this doesn't even like change the fact that your creature's going to die, because if your opponent blocks your 4/4 with a 2/2 and a 2/3 or something like that, your 4/4 is still going to die. It's not like you're saving your creature. You're just like turning Rabbit Attack into a minor boost plus a card draw, which is just not generally going to be something you're happy doing, and as such, it's not a card you should be taking. Next up is Oracle's Restoration. For a single green mana, you get a sorcery. That's right, a sorcery that says target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. You draw a card and gain 1 life. This card reads out as if it would be an instant. Multiple people I have faced in person have thought it was an instant already. It looks like the sort of like minor combat trick that could be a really effective tool. Buffs your creature, wins a comp, but it's not. It's a sorcery. You play this at sorcery speed, your creature gets a small boost, you draw a card, you gain a life. Sometimes you'll have some life gain synergies that this can work with, but the problem is, again, you need Oracle's Restoration with specifically a card that rewards you for gaining life. You need a situation where the +1/+1 actually matters, and there's just so many cards you can play that are just going to consistently have a real impact on the game, whereas Oracle's Restoration, just imagine you draw this and you're like on the defensive and you're just like spending your mana to just like try to draw through your deck to some card that actually will help you block or actually help you stabilize. Whereas Oracle's Restoration is like, okay, I'm on the front foot, I'm playing my card, I'm boosting my creature temporarily so I can attack my opponent. Your green deck's often on the defensive foot, or you just are on the draw in a game, you have a slow start, and you have your Oracle's Restoration, and you're like, oh gosh, I can't even play Oracle's Restoration because what if they kill my creature in response, and I just get blown out for my like 1 mana sorcery that I was just like trying to use as a synergy piece. There's just better cards you can be playing, and this is one of those ones that like doesn't have the upside to justify the fact that when you're behind, or when you don't have another like a creature in play, or you just like need to do like literally anything that affects the board state, you get this like temporary boost. You just shouldn't be like trying to put these cards in your deck. And then the final card we're looking at is Harsh Annotation. For 1 and a white, you get an instant that says destroy target creature. Its controller creates a 1/1 white and black inkling creature token with flying. This is the classic removal spell that gives your opponent something, and in this case, giving your opponent a 1/1 flyer is a major downside. In a lot of the situations you have removal, especially cheap removal, you want to at least have the option to use it on your opponent's small creatures. Maybe they have a 2/2 creature with an ability that's really annoying, or they have like a 3/3 that's starting to kind of like be a problem and you don't have like a good block for it at the moment. And you want to be able to use your cheap removal spell to kill it. That's one of the benefits of having a cheap removal spell. And turning your opponent's creature into a 1/1 flyer that can still chip in, still deal damage to you is really, really a big downside for this sort of card, because a 1/1 flyer is like a real card. It's going to have an impact on the game. A lot of the time it can chip in for 2 or 3 points of damage over the course of several turns if you don't have flyers of your own. And as another downside, if you're on the front foot and you're trying to pressure your opponent and you cast like Harsh Annotation to remove your opponent's blocker, you're spotting them a chump blocker, or maybe sometimes even a creature that can trade with one of yours. Say you have like a 3/1 or something like that. Harsh Annotation doesn't really deal with the problem that you needed to deal with, and you would just rather put a better removal spell in your deck. And obviously you're like, well, I don't always have the option to play a better removal spell, but putting a weak card in your deck just because you feel like you need more removal is not going to help you win more games, because you could just play something else that's a more powerful effect that can be more consistently helping you, maybe as a creature or a card that is a combat trick, some other way to kind of fill this role of helping you pressure your opponent, helping you stabilize against starts that your opponent might have, that doesn't rely on giving your opponent like a resource when you play your card, because you're almost 1.5ing yourself for 1. Like it's almost like you're 2-for-1ing yourself when you kill your opponent's creature and give them a 1/1 flyer, because your opponent would often like be pretty happy getting a 1/1 flyer into play. Like maybe they'd play like a 2-mana 1/1 flyer that had some sort of ability or something like that. And Harsh Annotation, giving that to your opponent for free, means it's not a card you should be playing in your decks, and is the sort of thing where when you are playing this in your games, it's going to hurt your chances of winning when you cast this spell, which is never something you want with your cards. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag 10traps in the comment section down below, because as I mentioned, these cards are generally traps, and you should be looking not to play them in your decks unless you have a very specific reason to be doing so. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.